The truth seemed to have finally put an end to that dark chapter of her life, but reality, as often happens, was much more multifaceted and mysterious than Alessia could imagine. While Marco was being tried for his deception, a new phase of Alessia's life opened up, made up of answers to questions she had never dared to think about and new questions that life, with its unpredictability, posed to her every day. In the days following the trial, Alessia's house transformed into a small laboratory of interior reconstruction. Every object, every photo, every corner of the room where fear once lived, now told the story of a rebirth. Alessia began to collect memories of happy moments spent with Marco, but no longer to regret them, but rather to understand them better, that happiness had been true, but had been tainted by selfish choices and deceit. During the evenings spent leafing through old albums, Alessia's mind opened to new reflections, how one could forgive, but above all how one could learn to love oneself again before being able to love someone else. Stefano, the faithful officer who had helped her save Luca and solve the mystery of Marco's disappearance, soon became much more than a simple ally in the fight against injustice. His constant presence, his understanding gaze and his determination to seek the truth allowed Alessia to rediscover her trust in men. Stefano was not just an investigator, but a man of values, with a personal history marked by difficult choices and a heart that had known as much pain as joy. In quiet moments, when the night spread its blanket of silence over the neighborhood, the two found themselves talking at length, confidences that went far beyond the case that had brought them together. They spoke of their dreams, of the fears they had hidden for too long, and of how life could, despite everything, always surprise. Luca, the little hero of the story, grew up in this climate of hope and resilience. At school, the child was always the first to offer a smile to a classmate in difficulty, and his love for books became a bridge to discover new worlds. Alessia began to notice in him that insatiable curiosity that, in a certain sense, reminded her of her own youth, times in which the future was an open book, to be written with one's own choices, without knowing that sometimes destiny could hide plots as intricate as they were painful. One day, during a walk in the park, while the setting sun painted the sky orange and pink, Alessia stopped to watch Luca playing with other children. At that moment, a question flashed through her mind: what would have become of her if she had never known pain? And even more, how could she have transformed that pain into a life force? That same evening, sitting in the silence of the kitchen, she began to write. She wasn't sure if those were pages of a diary or fragments of a novel, but those words, full of emotions and hopes, began to give shape to a new identity. Writing became for her a means of liberation, a way to give voice to the emotions she had always kept hidden. As Marco served his sentence, unexpected details about his former life came to light. Some neighbors recalled seeing him, in the early years of his marriage, engaged in acts of generosity and dedication. But soon, his ambitions and lust for money had pushed him to make increasingly questionable choices. An old friend, reluctant to recall the past, confided in Stefano that Marco had always spoken of a perfect plan, a plan to escape reality and start over, even at the cost of betraying those closest to him. This revelation sent a shiver down Alessia's spine. The figure of Marco, so familiar yet so distant, was slowly turning into an even greater enigma. The legal case, however, also offered Alessia a light at the end of the tunnel. During the trial, technical details emerged that made it clear how Marco had planned everything down to the smallest details: the simulation of the accident, the transfer of funds, and even a series of falsified documents. The strategy was so well conceived that even the most expert investigators had spent months putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Alessia, although she suffered in reviewing every detail of the betrayal, found in that reconstruction a sort of poetic justice. The cruel deception was unmasked, and with it, the possibility of starting over. As time went by, Alessia and Stefano began to plan small projects together to help other people get out of crisis situations. They organized meetings, evenings of testimonies and moments of sharing, where those who had lived similar experiences could find comfort and, above all, the strength to get up again. These initiatives, born almost by chance, soon became the symbol of a community that had not given up in the face of adversity. Alessia, with her example, demonstrated that pain could be transformed into positive energy, capable of changing not only one's own life, but also that of others. One winter evening, while the snow was slowly falling on the neighborhood and the streetlights created an almost magical atmosphere, Alessia received an anonymous letter. The content, handwritten in an elegant calligraphy, invited her to meet in an old cafe in the historic center, where she could find further evidence regarding a secret that had been hidden for years. The message, while suggesting that there were other deceptions to be revealed, was also a promise of truth and closure. With her heart in turmoil, Alessia decided to follow that shadow of the past, convinced that every fragment of truth could help her reconstruct not only her own story, but also that of many others who had suffered similar injustices. At the meeting, she met an older man, with a wise air and an intense gaze, who introduced himself as a former colleague of Marco. He told Alessia how, in the early years of their relationship, Marco had shown signs of an altruistic ideal, but that over time, his soul had become clouded by the desire for power and money. The man described in detail how Marco had begun to surround himself with influential people, manipulating situations and exploiting every opportunity to enrich himself at the expense of others. That story, steeped in bitterness and regret, brought out in Alessia a mixture of compassion and determination, compassion for that man who, despite everything, still had a glimmer of humanity, and determination not to let others suffer the same fate. Following that meeting, Alessia found another piece of the puzzle in Marco's past, documents and letters that testified to a secret connection with some members of a less-than-transparent financial company interested in high-risk speculation. With Stefano's help, she began a new parallel investigation, which also involved economic and legal experts. These searches brought to light a whole circle of illicit practices, in which Marco was just a pawn in a much larger game. The involvement of institutions and powerful people made Alessia understand that her battle was far from over, but it was also a further incentive to fight, not only for herself and for Luca, but for anyone who found themselves trapped in networks of deceit and abuse. During this period of renewed activity, the relationship between Alessia and Stefano became increasingly deeper and more sincere. The evenings spent together, between impromptu dinners and long candlelit chats, revealed the beauty of complicity and mutual trust. They talked about the future, about small dreams and big projects, like opening a small bookshop cafe where people could gather to share stories and hopes. That vision, so simple yet so ambitious, became the symbol of a life that, despite the scars of the past, was ready to be reborn with new light. Alessia learned that the truth, however painful, had the power to liberate. Every written page, every meeting, and every investigation had taught her that behind the appearance of things there were always more nuances, and that sometimes the greatest courage was to face uncomfortable truths in order to move forward. Her life, once dominated by fear and betrayal, was transforming into a path of redemption and rediscovery. So, as the past slowly dissolved over time and the scars turned into signs of resilience, Alessia finally found the strength to smile. She knew that, despite the pain, each experience had made her the strong and determined woman she was today. And as she watched Luca, intent on building imaginary castles in the park, she understood that the real treasure was not in money or fame, but in the ability to love and be loved authentically. The future, uncertain yet full of possibilities, opened up before her like a blank book, ready to welcome new stories, new truths and, why not, even some small mysteries to reveal. Alessia had learned to live with the past, to accept its shadows and transform them into light. And in that light, together with Stefano and Luca's contagious smile, she found the hope that every day, despite everything, was worth living.